Hey, what's up guys and welcome back. So today we're going to be walking through the Pivot Cycles Mach 5.5 Carbon. So to understand where this bike fits in, you need to understand the quick history of Pivot Cycles. So when Pivot launched 10 years ago, they launched with two bikes, the Mach 4 and the 5. So back then, the Mach 5 was their all-mountain bike, as they referred to it at the time. It was aluminum with 140 millimeters of travel and was instantly their best-selling bike. So the bike evolved into the more aggressive Mach 5.7, both in aluminum and carbon, but was eventually phased out as that trail market split into specialty categories. With the introduction of the Mach 429 Trail, which is their short travel 29er, and the Mach 6 and Firebird as their long travel enduro bikes. So to fill that gap in between, Pivot eventually launched the Switchblade, which is their mid-travel 29er or 27.5 plus convertible bike. So where does the Mach 5.5 fit in here? Well, at first glance, you might think it's the 27.5 version of the Switchblade, but if you ask Pivot, they'll tell you it's their spiritual successor to the original Mach 5 and 5.7, kind of a back-to-basics, do-it-all, one-quiver bike. So one of the notable features of the new 5.5 is that it was designed around 2.6-inch, not quite plus-size tires. So unfortunately, the bike I rode did not feature those tires, but instead was shod with 2.4-inch Onza Ibex tires on carbon MV M70 wheels. So the rest of the build featured Shimano XT XTR components with an 1146 cassette, XT brakes, a Fox transfer dropper, and a Renthal carbon bar. So let's talk about visual impressions, and I can't stress this enough. This bike looks absolutely burly in person. So everything from the down tube, the rear triangle, the 36mm stanchion fork, even the suspension links and bearings look oversized and absolutely stout. So of course looks are subjective, but to my eyes the Mach 5.5 is gorgeous and even better looking in person, especially with this matte red finish. From a design standpoint, the front and rear triangles flow really well together, and the curves near the upper triangle just scream masculinity. However, I wish Pivot would stop putting featured decals on their bikes. I have a feeling this 148mm spacing decal is going to look really dated in a few years. So I rode this bike for a couple hours in my usual spot, and my initial impressions are that the bike rides exactly how it looks. Long, slack, and burly stiff. The suspension also feels really supple at all times, and just with all pivots, it features the Dave Weagle or DW Link rear suspension. I have to say, Pivot struck a nice balance with their suspension tune on this bike. It has a terrific small bump compliance, which I suspected would hinder its pedaling performance, but surprisingly, unwanted suspension movement was kept to a minimum, even during short bursts out of the saddle. It's worth mentioning that I left the shock in the fully open position once I set my sag, and never felt the need to touch it further. And despite having a slack 66-degree head tube angle and a big 160mm fork up front, I didn't really feel the front end wandering all that much on the climbs either, which surprised me quite a bit. Alright, let's talk about how this bike descends, and let's just cut to the chase. This bike rips. It's an extremely capable bike for a really aggressive rider. It's quiet and soaks up bumps in a way that makes you feel like you're going a lot slower than you actually are. However, despite its short chainstays, I wouldn't exactly call this bike nimble. You really need to throw this thing around with some force to get it to do what you want. But it rewards you with an amazing downhill experience and gets better the harder you push it. So this bike definitely feels more serious than my Yeti SP5 or 4.5. I would categorize this bike as a long travel trail bike or even a short travel enduro bike. So this is a bike that rewards an aggressive rider who lives in some really rocky areas. So if you live in Moab, Tahoe, Arizona, or even parts of Colorado, this bike would definitely be on your short list. But even if you didn't live in those areas, this can easily be the one bike for many riders. So Pivot says the medium frame with shock weighs just 5.2 pounds, which is amazing considering how stiff and massive it looks. And while it may not have the ultimate pedaling efficiency of, say, an Ibis Ripley or even my Yeti, it's definitely more capable on the descents, yet still light enough to pedal all day. So what are some things I didn't like? Well, besides the feature decals, I do prefer to have just a little bit more mid-stroke in the suspension when popping off corners, which I think will go a long way in making this bike feel even livelier. I'm sure just adding a few PSI in the rear shock would have done this just the same. Alright guys, in summary, if you're in the market for a light, stiff, and aggressive trail bike that still pedals really well, this Mach 5.5 definitely needs to be on your shortlist. I hope you guys like this review, and I'll see you guys on the next one.